for joining us for today's Ipsos webinar, Exploring Affluent's Outlook on the Year Ahead. Today's presentation is being given by Tony in Calcaterra, and you can read more about him on the slide in front of you. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Tony in Calcaterra, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's Audience Measurement Team. Tony, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. I appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us today. When we met, about a year ago, we were talking about really the difficulties of the previous year of 2020 and what was hopefully the promise of 2021. It was really soon after the riots took place at the Capitol. Affluent opinions were really clouded by the toll that COVID was taking on lives, the contentious election, and they were really looking to the future as an opportunity to sort of put the negatives behind us. Vaccinations were just beginning at that point. They were beginning to roll out. There was hope that life was going to return to normal, really as close to normal as possible at that point. Now, we fast forward 12 months, and what we've experienced are two significant COVID mutations, Delta and now Omicron, further ideological polarization in the country, ongoing or growing worldwide conflicts, devastating natural disasters, and that really, all of that just sort of helps to understand where affluents are sitting today and where they're likely to be in the next several months. They still remain fairly upbeat, despite all of these things, and that frankly is a good thing for most marketers, because this is a group that represents the biggest spenders in virtually every category, with the exception of tobacco. We're going to give you a lot of information today, and it's going to come from two primary sources. The first is our ongoing affluent survey, which is in field 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We survey roughly 24,000 people a year. But then we're also going to be presenting data from our latest study, which was conducted, just closed field a week ago. And that is what we call the Q1 barometer. It's our annual study of the outlook and the finances of affluents. That was fielded from January 6th through the 18th, so very fresh data. We're going to start today by looking at hopes and expectations for the year. We're going to discuss how perceptions of the past year really are shaping the outlook for this year. And then we're going to talk about some potential storm clouds that are on the horizon and things that we need to be mindful of. We're going to look at how affluents see the state of the United States, the issues that are most important to them, especially as we look forward, as we look towards the midterm elections. I don't know if we look forward to them, and really because affluence, as I said, yields such a heavy influence in the marketplace, we're going to spend some time looking at their spending expectations and what we believe are going to be happening over the next several months. With the vast majority of these people still currently working, we're going to look at the details surrounding the working from home versus return to the office and what that really is going to look like and what it means. And then lastly, we're going to try to sum up all of this and give you some key takeaways that will make sense out of all of this data. So what I can tell you right now is that there really is an air of cautious optimism. It's not unbridled enthusiasm. That's just not happening at this point. It surrounds affluent Americans in this sense that when they think about the year ahead, they are weary of the pandemic. Clearly, like most Americans, 92% of affluents are vaccinated, fully vaccinated, and for those, most of them have either been boosted or are planning to be boosted. So they've taken precautions, which is not surprising. When we ask them about their expectations for the coming year, the word that we see most frequently is hope. And and that is both in terms of the belief that there are good things on the horizon, but also the need for them to have a positive outlook on life and on what is going to happen as we move forward. They do expect things to get better in a number of different ways, but they are clearly concerned about health, staying healthy, surviving the pandemic. They're looking to make their lives, particularly on the work-life balance, better than it has been. They want to secure their future retirement, and frankly, many of them are rethinking retirement as a result of the events of the last couple of years. Lastly, they want to get more enjoyment out. So, in their own words, what we're hearing is the desire to have an improved life, to get more enjoyment out of life, which, for so many of them is really about the return to travel, to vacations, to ease some of the tensions and the feelings. They want to spend more time with friends and family, particularly those that they haven't been able to spend time with over the last couple of years. Hope, it comes in all forms. In some instances, it's about new challenges, taking on new ways of looking at life, new dreams, fulfilling new dreams. It's really about the mindset of affluence. It's an entrepreneurial spirit that really rings bright in many affluents. They've spent a lot of the last couple of years rethinking life, rethinking what was important. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. But I love this quote from one of them, which is it's pretty basic. It's pretty clear that everyone wants to survive the pandemic, but the health crisis has also brought a number of new things or renewed senses, the importance of health and wellness in our lives. So it's more than avoiding COVID. It's really about taking steps to feel better both physically and emotionally, mentally. That desire really impacts affluents, as they think about work-life balance, as they think about what it means to be working from home during the worst of the pandemic and this return to the office, what that's going to look like. They've started to understand that there are new possibilities in terms of flexible work routines, things that will make their lives better or more fulfilling. Now, we know that working from home means that there are fewer hours lost to commuting, but we also, on the other hand, know that for many of them, those hours that they were commuting were now work hours. So they were working longer hours because work really never went away. If it was, sitting in your home office, your kitchen, your living room, wherever it happened to be. They realize, though, that they can now work and collaborate remotely, and it works, quite successfully. It's made a lot of people rethink about how they make their living and what is next for them. So we anticipate that we're going to see a lot of change. They want to solidify their own future, the future success of their family. We've heard from a lot of them about their desire to invest more, to save more. They want to build on what is already a solid financial foundation. 8 in 10 affluents right now believe that you're responsible for your own retirement, so that they need to take steps to make sure that they are going to be in a sound place. That means that they're actively involved in the management of their finances. And in fact, the good news is that 3/4 of them already feel financially secure. That's certainly more so on the on the older end of the spectrum than it is on the younger end, but the good news is that there's less stress among affluents than there is among non-affluents as they're thinking about their personal finances and what it means. Above all, from looking at all of the data, looking at reading all of the open-ended responses, they're looking for peace of mind. The last couple of years have really weighed on people so much. They're looking to regain control and getting on with their lives, and that has really an important lesson for all of the companies that are messaging to these folks. The Roman God Janus was the god of gates and doors. He was always depicted as having two faces, one that looked to the past, that understood where he came from, and the other that looked to the future and could see where he was going. So it really was very fitting that the first month of the year is named after him, because it is that time where we're reflecting on what came in the previous year and what we're about to do as we move forward. So let's dig into some of the data that we saw. In a nutshell, 2021 was a so-so year. Roughly half of affluents said that they thought it was a good year for them personally, as well as for their family. Frankly, the Dow surging 19% during the year didn't hurt. It made sense that we saw few people disagree that their careers and finances took a hit in 2021. In fact, when we asked them about their household net worth, we saw a very distinct minority of affluents saying that they lost ground over the course of the past year. And based on our 2021 fall data, the average affluent household now has a net worth of slightly more than $1.1 million. So a solid financial footing. We're going to talk more about finances in a second, but I did certainly want to just give you the top line. And even though they think they're feeling confident personally, once they look beyond their their immediate cocoon of their own home, their own family, affluents are very worried about the rest of the country. A third of them agree that 2021 was a good year for the U.S. economy, and that's relatively low. Barely 1 in 4 agree with the statement that 2021 was good for America as a whole. Now, we've often discussed the benefit of this financial insulation that affluents have, and therefore they don't have those immediate concerns. You think about the hierarchy of needs. And it's certainly true when we look at non-affluents, how they perceive the year. Barely a third of non-affluents thought 2021 was good for them personally. Significantly more of them, felt that things that their companies that they worked for actually benefited more so than they did. And, honestly, in a world where workers' rights are becoming highlighted every day more and more, the difference in that perception is going to be a critical one to note. It has ramifications for most companies. If employees feel that the companies benefited or did well, but they didn't, they're going to expect to see changes that benefit them. So, while the affluent households saw an increase, half of them saw an increase in their net worth, fewer than 1 in 3 of the non-affluents saw an increase in their household net worth. This is all likely due to a very hot real estate market. We're going to talk more about the distribution of assets in a little bit so that you can get a sense of why these things are changing. So, thankfully, we've been measuring these metrics for some time now. So, as a result, we can look at the trajectory over time. pre-pandemic, we typically saw that 3/4 of affluents were full of positive feelings, both about the year that had passed, as well as their expectations moving forward. We were not surprised, I don't think anyone was, when we looked at these numbers last January, and we saw numbers that were just far worse based on the experience of the pandemic. We decided to, because those numbers were so bad, we decided to re-ask the questions mid-year to get a sense of what was happening. And we did see some improvement, but it was considerably less than their expectations. The lift in expectations for the next 6 months were really pretty muted. Now, it is important to note that, though there's a 10% improvement in the expectations of 2022 compared to feelings about 2021, as we look at this data more closely, we see really the positive stuff is being driven by younger affluents. They distinctly have a much more positive attitude than boomers and seniors about the coming year. We're going to talk about some of the concerns that those younger generations have shortly, so that you can see where the generational differences are really occurring. We do note that close to 8 in 10 millennials are always enthusiastic, but close to 8 in 10 of them believe that 2022 is going to be a good year for them personally. So that's a nice kickoff. Now, shift the focus to the family, to beyond themselves personally. We see a fairly similar pattern to what we saw in the second half of 2021. It really wasn't any better than the first half. Thankfully, there is more hope for 2022. However, it really is still lower than pre-pandemic levels. So it's likely due to the rising rates of pediatric COVID, the difficulties associated with in-person learning and schooling that is causing this muted or this bigger concern for the families, for the extended families. We do see an uptick, albeit it's slight, in terms of how careers and finances fared last year, as well as the expectations for 2022. It certainly hasn't hurt that affluent household net worth increased significantly, certainly in the past 12 months. But there are jitters in the stock market, and if you just witness what has happened over the last couple of days, you can understand that this is a roller coaster ride. We're going to talk about why that's really important to affluents in a few slides. Now, from a career perspective, it also doesn't hurt that employers are really needing to do everything they can to recruit new hires and retain the ones that they already have. So yes, there's clearly been a great resignation, but the potential for career advancement, frankly, is there if affluents want it. Now, again, when we move outside of the cocoon, the view of America as a whole continues to be very low, with only 1 in 4 affluents believing that 2021 was good for the country. There's a market increase in expectations this year that sort of brings it more in line with where we have been in past years, but it's still quite low. So, I always think I sound like a broken record when I say, thanks to the financial insulation and the success of affluents, they feel protected. But the reality is that's exactly what it is. They do feel that they have the resources to weather the storm. They're less worried about themselves, and they're more worried about what happens in the rest of the country, because that does eventually impact them. They're realizing that they benefit in lots of ways based on their financial success, but they are going to start, or they are going to be worried about how others are faring. And that really does color their view of the U.S. economy as a whole. The challenges that that we're all seeing right now in terms of inflation, supply chain disruptions, difficulties in hiring, are really putting a damper on affluent views of the economy moving forward. 44% of them feel good about the prospects for the economy, but 32% do not. And 24% are just feeling neutral at this point and adopting a wait and see attitude. Now, the good news is that this is better than where we were just 3 months ago, when we were seeing pessimism about the economy rising sharply again. It's really a far cry from where we were during the worst of the pandemic, when pessimism outweighed optimism for the first time in almost 10 years. That was the last time that happened was during the debt ceiling crisis. But clearly we have to keep track and keep watching this, because it does have an impact on how much affluents are willing to spend. So as I said, we're not out of the woods yet. Clearly, there are issues. There are potential storm clouds on the horizon. I kind of think of us as marketing meteorologists, if you will. We've got to keep an eye on what is happening out there. Keep an eye on the weather. Like most Americans, affluents are really conflicted about politics. They're conflicted about public health issues. Reading through verbatim responses is probably one of the most difficult things in the world, because you are really getting this sort of Rorschach understanding of what's happening. Emotions are bubbling to the top. They're difficult to read because the comments are critical, with different groups blaming each other for the for the woes of the country. Yeah, I have to say that I've had to adopt a very tough skin reading through some of these to make it through some of the meaner comments. But that's the reality of where we are today. I'm not going to repeat some of them, but suffice it to say that that the next several months are going to continue to be stormy when it comes to political positioning. So all of that is helping to drive up overall stress levels. We've been asking for some time about how stressed people are on a scale of 1 to 10. It's affecting the younger generations much more so than the older generations, much more so than seniors and boomers. The result is that in view of the fact that the younger generations are not as well established, they have less of a cushion, if you will. They're going to need products and services that sort of make their lives easier, or at least ease their mental stress. Help them get over fears about the future and what this means. For so many of them, they're navigating what's radically altered work environments. Whereas the older, more experienced workers have things that have been established. They have routines. They have networks. For younger affluents, those things are not quite there yet. It's it's a difficult situation, and marketers really need to recognize the differences in the generations, targeting their messages accordingly. And that certainly is going to come into play for things like financial services companies, for companies that are looking to help people who have the money to buy things that are going to support them. Now, we should point out that close to 20%, 1 in 5 affluents are feeling extremely high levels of stress. Up until now, what we had been seeing was that there were more women who had been rating their stress as extremely high than men. But for some reason, in the last quarter, the recent data is showing us that just as many men are feeling stressed out as women. As I mentioned earlier, the stress is really hitting the younger folks much more so than the older folks. And in fact, 1 in 3 Gen Z affluents is experiencing high stress at this moment. That is going to change their outlook, change their behavior. That primary cause of stress, it's not going to surprise anybody. It's COVID, and it's really mounting pressures at work, either due to the fact that we are still in a situation where many people are working remotely, or they're returning part-time to the office. The fact is that work is a huge portion of our lives, and really isn't made easier by what's been happening over the last couple of years. In their own words, affluents are they're worried about health. They're worried about the safety of themselves and their families, and they're looking for relief from those pressures. That's likely to come in things like products and services that really make their lives either easier through taking care of normal things in their lives, more dining out, more food deliveries, those kinds of things, or it's going to be things like indulgences that make them feel better. Being able to get back to vacations where they're not worried about lockouts, or worried about difficulties in getting on a plane. They want to feel pampered. They want to feel luxuriated, if you will. Now, when we do talk to them and we ask them about the most important issues facing the country today, COVID has risen again to be the single most important issue. So, we're fully seeing 27% of people telling us that is the most important issue that needs to be addressed in the country. It fell to second place, interestingly, last quarter when the economy overtook it. But given the Omicron, variation and the surge in COVID cases, it's back up there at the top. It's certainly got people on edge, but it's not the only issue on their minds. Concerns about the economy, about healthcare in general, and frankly, the continued polarization, the political polarization of the country is, a major issue for people. Now, we did look at this across generations, and we do see that there's some commonality, there's some agreement. COVID is the number one concern among the generations, but then we start to see some clear differences about other aspects. So, for Gen Z, that younger generation, healthcare is the second most critical issue, then followed by the economy and the environment. They're the only group to rate concerns about guns and firearms among the top 10. When we shift over to millennials, what we're seeing is an increase in the percentage of people who are saying, well, I'm concerned about inflation. And they're the only group to talk about unemployment and the lack of jobs among the top 10 concerns in the country right now. Shifting over to boomers and seniors, it really is interesting to note that political polarization is seen as a bigger concern than the economy, inflation, or other hot button issues. And I think, the question really becomes, what are they going to do about it? We'll try to address some of that in a little bit. But what I did want to point out for marketers is that it's especially important for them to understand the issues that are important to individual generations, because we know that more than half of affluents consistently tell us that they would rather buy from a company that actively supports their community, even if it would be more expensive. So, the result is that so many companies are pursuing corporate social responsibility policies, and it's going to become more prevalent. It's going to be critical for companies really to understand which issues are important to which people, because that ultimately is going to decide or make sense as far as which issues they will stand up for or they'll comment on. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the midterm elections are coming and they're looming large. They're really affluents are looking at this and spending time thinking about it. Let's take a quick look at where things currently sit and frankly, what's likely to happen in the next couple of months. So for some time, we've been asking affluents whether the country is headed in the right direction or if it's off on the wrong track. And for most of that time, there were far more people who said that we were heading on the wrong track than there were people who were saying we were headed in the right direction. Now, earlier last year, there was this very brief period where the numbers flipped before really turning decidedly bad in the fourth quarter. Much of the right direction, wrong track, is tied to politics. And here again, the verbatim responses are really difficult to get through without feeling bad. During the Trump years, the comments from Democrats were stinging. They were just mean and negative. And of course, now under the Biden presidency, it's flipped so that the Republican comments are Republican affluent comments are really hard to read. They're very harsh. There's harsh rhetoric on both sides, blaming each other for the issues that they see as befalling the country. It should be noted, though, that there's a sizable portion of affluent Republicans who still feel that things are headed in the right direction. And that's been relatively stable over the past 12 months. And I think that has, the potential to have an impact on elections moving forward. So, coming off that record turnout in 2020, in that last federal election, we weren't surprised to see that there were large numbers of Americans who were planning to vote in this next election cycle, whether it was either in the local, state, or federal primaries or the general election. We do see that affluents are significantly more likely than non-affluents to plan to vote. But one of the concerning things as we look through it is the lower proportion of non-affluent women who are planning to vote, quite different from the rest of the country. Far more disturbing is the fact that younger affluents are so much less likely to vote in this next election cycle. And we know that this has been an issue for some time, but fully 1 in 5 Gen Z affluents tell us that they don't plan to vote in any election this year. It's really going to be critically important for the political parties to figure out a way to incentivize young voters to get to the polls. They're going to need to pay attention to those issues that they're telling us are critical or important to them. Otherwise, they're not going to generate enough enthusiasm to get a significant number of them, or enough of them, to make their voting choices. So when we look at the issues of concern, we looked at it previously by generation. Let's look at what happens with as we split it across the 3 political affiliations, if you will. We do see common theme, not surprising. COVID is number 1. The U.S. economy is, clearly important. And what we're seeing are things that are splitting the parties: healthcare, the environment, racial inequality important to Democrats, while inflation, crime, and immigration are important to Republicans. But it's really interesting for me to see that independents rate political polarization as a bigger issue than the economy. Their concern is clearly that if we can't figure out a way to find solutions to the polarization, we're never going to solve the other problems. We've got to somehow, bridge that chasm between groups in order to move forward. Now, we've asked affluents which party they're planning to vote for in the coming elections. We see that the Democrats are essentially locking arms and planning to vote for their party. Republicans are less unified, but they're still quite unified. There is a schism possibly within the party, over support for the former president. But the real issue in all of this is how independents are going to vote. So there's a slight advantage for Democrats among affluent independents at this point, although there are really just as many independents who say that they haven't made up their mind or they're going to vote for another party. So we're going to be tracking this throughout the year to see how things change, and we'll be reporting that back to you guys in our quarterly updates. All right, so now that we've given you a sense of where affluent's mindset sits, let's talk about what I think most of you want to know, which is how much will affluents spend in the next year, and what are they going to spend it on? So we often talk about the importance of affluent households to the economy, and that really comes from the fact that affluent households hold a tremendous amount of the net worth. And I know we've shown this slide or a variation of this slide to many of you before. But the reality is that 70% of the total net worth of the country is sitting among the top 20% of households. And that's $96 trillion. And frankly, as we look over time, it really is still true that the rich are getting richer. That gap between the top quintiles and the bottom quintiles is continuing to widen, so that affluent households are continuing to be critically important in all of this. One of the things that we've done is we've looked at the distribution of assets by households, by the quintiles, and really is important to note that currently affluent households have more of their assets sitting in things other than their homes and other than real estate. If we look at the lower quintiles, we're seeing almost half of the asset value of the lowest quintile households comes purely from the value of their homes, whereas only 20% of the asset value of affluents is coming from real estate. And that's dwarfed by the fact that 1 in every $3 affluent net worth dollars, asset dollars, is sitting in the stock market, in stocks and mutual funds. The reality is that it's going to be important to keep an eye on the stock market, really as a bellwether of how affluents are feeling and their spending patterns. In fact, really as we look at the increased wealth of affluent households over the last 20 years, we really can see the extraordinary growth of what's coming from stocks and equities. In 2001, more of affluent wealth was sitting in their homes, in their real estate holdings, and pension entitlements than it was in the stock market. Today, that looks completely different. There's a significantly higher portion sitting in investments. And the reality is fluctuations in the stock market have the real potential to either spur greater spending or perhaps put a damper on spending over time. So we do have to keep track of what's happening there as a means of understanding what's likely to happen. Now, the good news, though, is that while wealth has grown tremendously amongst affluent households, it's more than tripled in the last 20 years. The debt ratio, the amount of money that affluent households own relative to the assets they have, has dropped significantly. So, currently affluent households have a debt to asset ratio of about 8%. It's compared to where we were 20 years ago, that was sitting at close to 13%. So, as we look at it, they're in much better financial shape. And now the question is, what are they going to do with all that money? They've got big bank accounts. Thankfully, we're able to look at that through the affluent survey that we conduct. We've been tracking annual expenditures for many years, and we certainly saw shifts during the pandemic. Things like expenses related to dining out, it dropped quite a bit during the pandemic. Yes, we were doing more takeout, but the fact is we weren't dining in restaurant as much as we had been. So the good news on that front is that 61% of affluents are saying that they expect in 2022 to spend about the same or more money on dining out than they did pre-pandemic. That's good news for the restaurant industry, as well as other aligned industries. It's especially going to be true as we come out of the Omicron resurgence, which hopefully will be soon. At least the markers are looking as if we are getting close to the peak. Travel was clearly one of the hardest hit things during the pandemic. It also happens to be one of the things that affluents are most passionate about. So, they seek out travel. It really is a remedy for the pressures of day-to-day life, to get some relaxation. It fell close to 40% from pre-pandemic levels. Travel still happened, it just was happening in a different way. There was a shift to vacations by car as opposed to vacations by air. Again, the good news is that about 2/3 of affluents say that they expect to return to pre-pandemic levels, and that they're going to go back to the amount of money they spend or spend more in 2022 than they did before the pandemic. Now, we've been talking about people going back to work, and apparel had already started to come back. We did see that there was an increase back in the fall, particularly as people were returning to the office and having to give up yoga pants and other casual, at-home work attire to suddenly come back to the need to dress more appropriately. We're going to see 70% of them are telling us that they're going to spend as much or more in the coming year as they did. Now, on the automotive front, we know there was a slightly different story here, which was, first we know that roughly half of all affluent households plan to purchase, lease a new vehicle, or a vehicle, new and or pre-owned vehicle in the next year. And then with the supply, really hampered by the supply chain issues, things like the chip availability, the rising price of pre-owned vehicles. It wasn't surprising that we saw an increase in what people were telling us that they spent, and 3/4 of them were telling us that they're going to continue to spend at least as much or more than they did pre-pandemic. So it's good news for the automotive industry, good news for those companies. We also know that some of this is being caused by the fact that many affluents have shifted as they've gone back to work. They've shifted to personal transportation away from public transportation, as they worry about their health and the contagion. So, we do think that new vehicle acquisition is going to be important as people continue to return to the office. Now, over the course of the pandemic, we did see a large uptick in expenditures on technology. And, again, that made perfect sense because, there was the need to optimize your home office, to, figure out a better way for kids to learn remotely. And ultimately, we were all looking for distraction and entertainment, to sort of soothe our minds from what was going on in the world. So we saw technology expenditures, personal technology expenditures increase quite a bit, and that trend is likely to continue in 2022. 85% of affluents are telling us they're going to spend, equal to or more than they did pre-pandemic. Will the return to offices diminish these numbers? It's really unlikely in the short term. In all likelihood, we're going to continue to see a hybrid approach to working and the need to make sure that we have the right equipment in order to do those things. So let's talk about just what is going on with the return to work, because it does have an impact on all of these things, on all of these expenditures. And it really is a mixed bag for affluents. Thankfully, because of the type of work that affluents tend to do, 6 in 10 affluents were able to shift work from in office to at home during the pandemic. In addition, about 8% of them said that they worked from home prior to the pandemic, so they were already there. That meant that 2/3 of the affluent workforce was actually working from home during the pandemic, and there were lots of lessons that were learned. The good thing is that most affluents thought it worked quite well. 3/4 of them who shifted, 3/4 of the people who shifted from in office to at home believed that it worked just as well, and in some instances even better than being in the office. And that really has led to a rethinking about what work means and what people want out of life. So when we asked them about returning to the office, only half of them, barely half of them, want to return to the office full time. About 1 in 4, say that they want to work from home part of the time and partly in the office. And then there's another 23% that say they don't want to return to the office ever. They don't want to be back in an office working environment. That's going to have major repercussions for companies as they're trying to understand what the future office workspace is going to look like. It's going to have ramifications for commercial real estate, for the local businesses supporting business areas. I mean, if you think about coffee shops and restaurants, and the lower number of office workers, we're going to see some radical changes. And it also impacts the technology companies, that are selling products and services really that help us work remotely, help us collaborate, from different places around the country, around the world. Okay, so where do we currently sit? Right now, nearly half of the affluents who shifted to at-home work or working from home have returned back to the office full-time. Another 27% say they're back at the office part-time. The rest have not returned, they're still working from home. Now, of those who are back in the office, about a little bit more than half of them returned voluntarily, and the other half are back due to company mandates, not necessarily that they wanted to be there. Now, most of the people who are still working from home don't expect to return anytime soon, so we don't think we're going to see a major shift over the next couple of months. In fact, 1/3 of them are saying they're never going back to the office. So, clearly a large disruption. Now, as they return to the office, they're experiencing a fairly wide range of precautionary policies that are meant to keep them safe, whether you're talking about people who have already returned or people who are going to be returning soon or in the future. More than half of the companies say they're going to require employees, they either have or there will be requiring employees to be fully vaccinated. Many companies are reducing the number of days that people are going to be working in the office, or changing the physical setup of the office, reorganizing space so that there's more space between employees, or limiting the number of employees in an office at any particular time. The result of all of this is that we're going to continue to see differences in how affluents, as well as many other portions of the population, work, commute, manage their careers, as what's coming next. We asked them about how the changes were going to impact their work-life balance. And it was rather interesting to me that few people felt it was going to make it worse. I thought for sure that people would be complaining about going back, to commuting and back into the office. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it's really likely due to the fact that although people spent less time commuting, working from home meant that there was no separation of work and home. The fact that your office was right there often meant that people were working much longer hours. It was easy to continue to work because you didn't have to worry about getting on a train and going home. Now, women were significantly more likely to say that the return to office would negatively impact their work-life balance. And I think that that is not a surprising finding, because what we did know, or what we do know from the pandemic, was that women bore an unfair burden during the pandemic, because so many of the household responsibilities fell to them in addition to their working routine. So things are not going to change there until schools are really back to normal, back to in-person learning, and we don't have the kinds of disruptions that we have right now. One last thing about work, and that's really that business travel is still lagging far behind where it was. Only 1 in 5 affluents tells us that their companies are supporting business travel at pre-pandemic levels. An additional 29% say they're traveling, but on a limited basis. And this is the lifeblood of many airlines and hotels, as well as businesses that cater to business travel. This is going to take a long time before it comes back, if it ever does come back. That means that for the travel industry, a lot of programs that have been designed for business travel are going to need to be made up by personal travel. So we will see changes in approaches. Okay, so deep breath. What do you make of all of this? Well, I think there are 4 key takeaways here. The first is that in terms of expectations, we do see that there's a lot of positive belief in terms of improvements for 2022. 2 and 3 affluents, think it's going to be good for them personally. It's a lift from 2021, but it's still not where we would like it to be. They're still lower than pre-pandemic levels, and that's largely caused by COVID, fatigue, concerns about the economy. As Omicron starts to peak and go down, hopefully, we think that moods will improve, and we'll keep an eye on this over the course of the year, because that does impact how people are spending and what they're doing. In terms of expenditures, we know that affluents are sitting on a ton of money. And it's, thankfully or luckily, it has grown during the pandemic so that they are in very good financial shape. We think that technology companies and automotive companies are going to benefit the most, but the travel companies are going to need to figure out ways of capturing dollars that might have been there before, particularly in terms of business travel, shifting it to money that's going to come from personal vacations. We do know that, as a cautionary tale, there's a lot of money, a lot of affluent money, affluent wealth that is sitting in the stock market. So we need to keep an eye on what's happening there, keep an eye on what's happening with interest rates and the Federal Reserve as a, really an indication of what is going to transpire for affluents in this year and the future. The elections are concerning for everybody, but they are clearly a big concern for affluents. We're hoping that we see large numbers of people voting. Independents are really going to be the big decision makers, since members of the two dominant political parties are pretty much going to vote for their party. And then, as we really look at the return to office, we're going to continue to see lifestyle modifications that happen. 2/3 of affluents worked from home for some part of the pandemic, and that really changed their attitudes and their opinions about work and about how their lives could look, given the new normal, if you will. Only half of those, who worked from home wanted to go back. So we are definitely seeing, some shifts and some changes. So I'll leave you with that, with one other thing. Please join us on February 23rd for our next webinar, which is going to look at the physical fitness, or the fiscal fitness, sorry, how affluents are flexing their financial muscle. We're going to spend some time looking at investment approaches and the strategies that will be in place for 2022, looking at how people are reallocating their financial accounts, services that they're using, the sources of information that they use to make financial decisions. We're going to spend some time talking about the adoption of cryptocurrencies and things like non-fungible tokens, NFTs, which are becoming even more important. So in any case, thank you all. I know it's been a long session, but I really appreciate your time and hope you have a great day. I'll shift this back over to Ellen, and we'll talk soon.
Wow, thanks so much, Tony, for today's really jam-packed and interesting presentation. And of course, at any time, please reach out. We would welcome to connect with you directly. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thanks, Tony.